Hello, this is Roger Congleton, starting the new section on utilitarianism. And today's lecture is in our kind of sequence, lecture 4A. So what we're going to talk about today is the basic foundations of utilitarianism as were laid out basically by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And the next time we're going to talk about kind of refinements in the theory that emerged towards the end of the 19th century. So utilitarianism is a kind of important break with the past in a way. That is, it's quite different from Kant, it's quite different from Smith, it's quite different from the court and so forth, back to More and Erasmus. But there's a sense in which it's really just a return to Aristotle. Okay, that is, if you remember, Aristotle emphasizes happiness as the goal of life, and that people take steps to try to become happy, although Aristotle believes that people aren't very good at it, and they need some training, they need some advice about how to live a good life. And the purpose of the ethics is arguably to provide that advice. Utilitarians generally think that people understand how to be happy, and they don't need much advice to do so. On the other hand, they do think that policymakers need advice in order to help construct a good society, because they may not properly understand what a good society is, namely the one that utilitarians prefer. So utilitarians generally try to maximize the sum of happiness in a community, in a nation, in the society of interest. There are different ways to think about how one might construct that sum, but for the most part the people writing in the first half of the 19th century do this in kind of an intuitive way. They think that the kinds of things that make you happy are relatively obvious and commonsensical, and so they can construct their arguments using examples and illustrations from ordinary life that virtually everyone who reads their work would agree with. Now, of course, it's not true that they won the debate instantly and that all of a sudden the world became utilitarian. These guys and gals were politically active for much of the 19th century. They wrote books, wrote pamphlets, they wrote editorials. You know, they were heavily engaged in trying to persuade people to adopt some of their ideas. And if they couldn't persuade people to adopt their entire philosophy, you know, they would be happy if they could persuade you to adopt one or two of their policy positions. So, if we think about the origins of utilitarianism in the 19th or late 18th and early 19th century, I think most people would agree that this really begins with Bentham and his circle of fellow travelers who are also utilitarians. Bentham inherited quite a bit of wealth early on, and it allowed him to kind of sponsor a utilitarian circle and sponsor utilitarian thinkers who weren't necessarily earning enough money to keep their policy interests and philosophical interests going. This group of utilitarians really through much of the 19th century was not engaged in intellectual pursuits in the way an academic would be today, except for Bentham. They were people who did utilitarian thinking kind of as a hobby. That would be true of John Stuart Mill, for example. Bentham was more or less a full-time intellectual because he had the resources to be one. He had people help him out by transcribing his thoughts, sometimes polishing them up. In fact, Mill, when he was a teenager, did quite a bit of editing for Bentham. The key element of Bentham's approach and subsequent utilitarian approaches is that if you think about all moral issues, you can reduce them down to whether they increase happiness on average or reduce it on average. If they increase it on average or increase the sum of utility or happiness in a community, then it's a good policy, a good type of behavior, and is praiseworthy because of that. And so ultimately it's whether the behavior increases average utility in the community that determines whether it's a good idea, bad idea, good policy, bad policy, good action, bad action, and so forth. On the other hand, actions that reduce average utility in the community of interest, in the society of interest, those are bad policies, evil policies, blameworthy policies. Right? These are behaviors and policies to be avoided. So it's a really clean and simple analytical device, and the intuition is, I think, fairly sharp for anyone who believes that you should pay attention to the welfare of individuals when you think about a good life or a good society. And so it was a very powerful movement and still very evident in economic circles today. In fact, Bentham wrote an economics book, as did Mill. Both their books were used for textbooks for years and years during the 19th century. So they're highly influential as economists, but they're mostly remembered outside economics for their work in philosophy and political theory. So the other thing to keep in mind is at the beginning of this period, we'll call it 1800, the medieval order is still going on. Right? So remember that medieval order with its monopoly church, with its hereditary power structure, kings and barons and so forth on down the line. That system had been in place for on the order of 1,000 years, and was still basically the most common form of government in this period in Europe. Now in the U.S., or what became the U.S. during the 18th century, of course that was no longer the case. So we were kind of an outlier in this point of history. The U.S. was the only large country entirely grounded on electoral processes for its leadership and for its laws and regulations. Of course, the electoral foundations weren't as broad as we would think they should be today, but they were, by the standards of history, extraordinarily broad and included essentially all free men in most parts of the new country called the United States. It did not obviously handle women very well. Women did not have the vote, and it did not handle slavery very well outside of the Northeast. In the northeastern United States, slavery was already illegal, but in the South it remained an important part of their economy, and which is most likely why they resisted reforms, even when they were tried by fellow Southerners who lobbied for the end of slavery. So I have, as usual, a set of slides that I'm going to try out, and this will conclude my introduction. So I thought I'd start this slideshow off with a painting of one of the port streets in New York City at this time, or around this time. So this is a painting done roughly in 1827 by William Bennett. You'll notice that there are lots and lots of ships on the left. They're not gigantic by today's standards at all. They look pretty modest in size. These are ships from up and down the Atlantic coast, as well as ocean-going vessels. There are lots of people moving goods and services into storage areas and onto carts for shipping elsewhere in the city, or in some cases onto another boat. It's highly informal compared to today's setup. You just basically walk right across the street from a nice little 3- or 4-story brick building, and you're at the seaport, and instead of having to navigate through a whole bunch of security and fences and so forth. New York City at this time was, I guess we would call it a small city, 185,000 people. See, I've dropped a couple of zeros there. And it was rapidly growing in this period. The 19th century is the period in which the more urban areas of the New World really became cities. New York City had only had 72,000 people in it in 1810. So, as I said in the introduction, outside the United States, their economic development was also accelerating, but the political system was still pretty thoroughly grounded in the old medieval system with hereditary power structures, kings, dukes and barons and so on, and monopoly churches in most parts of Europe. So everybody in France was Catholic at the time, at least in principle. In Germany, this was true at the level of what I sometimes call duchies, sort of the sub-component parts of what came to be Germany in the 19th century, where the senior noble, the most powerful noble in the territory, would determine what the religion would be. Often a choice between Lutheranism or Catholicism. Scandinavia was basically Lutheran at this time. And at the beginning of the century, it also had monopoly churches. A lot of that changes in the 19th century. We aren't going to focus much attention on that in this course, and it's not much focused on in this book. The political changes of the century were the subject of another of my books, called Perfecting Parliament, published about 10 years ago. So what we're going to focus on in this chapter are four utilitarians. They're an interesting group, and they're interesting for a couple of reasons. One is they're all basically people who believe in the utilitarian principle, that the aim of society, the proper aim of public policy and in a good society is to increase the average happiness of people in that society. However, you can see that one of the things that changes during the century that we're going to be covering is ideas about the consequences of public policies. And that's partly because economic science is developing in this period fairly rapidly compared to earlier periods. And ideas about the consequences of public policies are becoming better understood. Mostly this is still done at an intuitive level. There's not much data being collected or analyzed during this period at the national level. There are, of course, submarkets and so forth that are pretty well studied, like agricultural markets. And our first utilitarian is Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy grew up in a comfortable family, inherited a good deal of family wealth, and more or less set himself up as the center of, as an intellectual for most of his life. Bentham and his intellectual circle could be regarded as followers of Aristotle's views of ethics and society. However, they did not place any particular stress on the need for character formation. There's no emphasis or even mention, as far as I've come across, of intellectual or moral excellence being goals for individuals, at least in Bentham's work. There's a bit of this in Mill's work, but not in Bentham that I've come across. And so what we're going to do at first here is just go through Bentham's theory of ethics, and it's something that all students of economics are already somewhat familiar with, because it really forms the foundation of what economists call welfare economics, that are used in virtually every class when one tries to analyze the consequences of public policy. So Bentham begins his justification for the utility principle with the observation that pleasure and pain, broadly understood, is the root source of all human conduct. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all that we do, in all that we say, and all that we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection to them will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. So pleasure and pain drives everything in human decision making, according to Bentham. Now he has his view of pleasure and pain is not just your instantaneous sensation, but your sense of gains and losses throughout life that may take years to occur and so forth. So it's not that he thinks that we're like pinballs, just kind of driven around by whatever we feel at an instant. We do think and we do plan, but he would argue those plans are evaluated in terms of their consequences, in terms of the pleasure and pain that they generate for us. And he's going to call the pleasure or level of satisfaction or happiness utility. So this is a kind of unusual use of the term utility. Utility at the time was meant to imply something about usefulness, right? So a shovel is useful, a broken shovel is not useful. So a shovel has utility, a broken shovel does not have utility. And you can see that what he's doing is kind of generalizing this idea. An idea has utility if it adds to your happiness. An idea does not have utility or generates its opposite if it does not contribute to your happiness or makes you worse off. By utility is meant the property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. All this in the present case comes to the same thing, or what comes again to the same thing, to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the parties whose interest is considered. So he's going to use this as a kind of model of choice. Anybody who has had intermediate micro knows that we use this model still today. In that class, we would model individuals as utility maximizers, and the way the models are constructed, more or less take for granted that you understand what utility means, okay, and you find it plausible. Most people who teach intermediate micro don't teach it as linked back to psychological ideas like benefits, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, but the term actually makes a lot more sense if you do. Although Bentham emphasizes the sum of happiness within a community, he does so from the perspective of methodological individualism. That is, he doesn't regard communities as having their own independent level of happiness. The community's level of happiness is the sum of the individual happinesses in that community. There's no, in his mind, no entity, true entity of a community that can experience happiness or joy. It's only the individuals inside it who can. The community is a fictitious body composed of the individual persons who are considered as constituting, as it were, its members. The interest of the community then is what? It's the sum of the interests of the several members who compose it. It is in vain to talk of the interest of the community without understanding what is the interest of the individual. An action may be said to be conformable to the principle of utility, or for shortness sake, to utility, meaning with respect to the community at large, when the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community is greater than any it has to diminish it. So a couple of points that are interesting in this statement. One is that he uses the word tendency, right? So it's not necessarily the case that every single action that is in accord with the principle of utility always increases utility for the community, always increases the average community and the average utility in that community. But it systematically has a tendency to do so, right? So you can have bad luck. Some actions you take have kind of stochastic elements to that. You don't know exactly what's going to happen when you do X, Y, and Z. But if on average X, Y, and Z increase utility, then it's a utility enhancing, a moral activity, proper activity. If it doesn't have this property, then it's not. Even if in some cases the end result is not as good as you'd hope, that is, it actually winds up reducing your utility rather than increasing it, out of bad luck or or events beyond your control, it could still be a moral activity. And he goes on to say, of an action is conformable to the principle of utility, in which case we could either say that it is one that ought to be done, or at least it is not one that ought not to be done. That is, if an activity increases utility, you may have a moral obligation to do it if you're someone who is a devotee of utilitarianism. And even if you're not, it's not an activity that should be ruled out. It should be blocked in some sense. One may also say that it is right, it should be done, at least that it is not wrong, it should be done, that it is a right action, at least that it is not a wrong action. When thus interpreted, the words ought, right, and wrong, and others of that stamp have a meaning, clear meaning, whereas otherwise they have none. So he's arguing that this utility principle makes sense of a lot of moral vocabulary, and it makes it sensible in a much clearer, transparent way that isn't quite as dependent on intuition as many ideas in moral theory are. Right? You basically just have to judge whether, on average, it increases happiness or not. Insofar as people are similar, we all have some ability to kind of judge that, as argued by Adam Smith in the last chapter. And so we can kind of, approximate or estimate or guesstimate even to some extent whether utility is rising or not as a consequence of some action or policy, using our ability to kind of think about other people's welfare or imagine it. And it's true of other moral principles, the utility principle can be internalized. It's not entirely an intellectual activity. A man may be said to be a partisan of the principle of utility when the internal approbation or disapprobation he annexes to any action or to any measure is determined by and proportionate to the tendency which he conceives it to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the community. So if you think in terms of the virtue and guilt payoffs that we'll be using in the next, after we get through this overview of philosophical ideas, essentially, if you've internalized it, you will have some internal appreciation or approval of yourself or disapproval of yourself that are linked to whether your actions tend on average to increase happiness in the community or reduce it. In other words, to its conformity or unconformity to the laws or dictates of the utility principle. Bentham also argues, and this is true through Mill, that basically relatively few of one's personal efforts to obtain or increase happiness for oneself or one's family have spillover effects on others. And therefore, an ordinary person does not have to think very hard about his choices. He basically should do whatever makes him happy as he understands the procedures that will deliver that happiness and not worry too much about other things. However, a legislator who's in a position to influence thousands of people through the laws that he or she adopts, that person should think carefully about the impact of the policies on all people in his society, in his territory, and try to judge whether on average this is going to increase or diminish happiness, and only adopt policies that increase on average happiness. So in Bentham's terms, there's no case in which a private man ought not to direct his own conduct to the production of his own happiness and of that of his fellow creatures. Prejudice apart, this means that whatever generates pleasure for a person, even if it's a kind of informal game like a computer game, or in this case a silly parlor game called pushpin, prejudices apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. If the game of pushpin furnishes more pleasure, it is more valuable than either, at least to that individual. This is something Mill will probably disagree about, but I think it's an interesting kind of take on this and is completely consistent with the utility principle. Everybody has happiness. Everybody knows how to acquire, advance their own happiness. And therefore, if someone chooses pushpin over poetry, that means that pushpin is probably increasing that person's utility more than poetry would have. Bentham also provides the first clear statement of the idea that there are mutual gains from exchange. And this is partly because the utility framework gives you a vocabulary for thinking about internal gains to trade. How much a person gains from a trade would be his extra utility, his extra happiness generated from the exchange. And you'll see that this is a departure from Aristotle's thinking about trade, where trade always requires some equivalence. That the financial value of the thing given up is exactly equal to the financial value of what you get. But utilitarians stress the subjective effect, whether you're happier after you get it, how much happier you are after you get it, and so forth. Those are the gains from exchange. Some advantage results from every exchange, provided it be made intentionally and without fraud. Otherwise, such an exchange would not be made. There would be no reason for making it. Under this point of view, the two contracting parties receive an equal benefit in money terms, a la Aristotle. But each one of them surrenders what suits him less, that he may acquire that which suits him more. In each transaction of this kind, there are two masses of new enjoyment. Both the buyer and the seller are better off. But though all trade be advantageous, a particular branch, a particular side of the transaction may gain more than the other. It may be more advantageous for one of the parties than to the other. There's no necessary equivalence in that sense. And he goes on to make a case for basically free trade, drawing on the work of Adam Smith in this Wealth of Nations. Although he also defends credit markets, something that was held in low esteem, even in this period. In commerce, ignorant nations have treated each other as rivals who could only rise upon the ruins of one another. But you can see the previous quote implies that there are mutual gains to trade, that both parties are better off after a transaction than before. So he can kind of shoot it down on his own reasoning, but here he draws on Adam Smith. The work of Adam Smith is a treatise upon universal benevolence because it has shown that commerce is equally advantageous for all nations, each one profiting in a different manner according to its natural means, that nations are associates and not rivals in the grand social enterprise. Usury, which, if it must be an offense, is an offense committed with consent, that is, with the consent of the party supposed to be injured. It cannot merit a place in the category of offenses unless the consent were either unfairly obtained or unfreely obtained. In the first case, it coincides with defraudment, and the other with extortion. So he's arguing that credit markets are just another area of exchange, and no real difference need be introduced to account for it. It's also a place where there are mutual gains from trade and shouldn't be heavily regulated. So if you think of Bentham's arguments, there's a sense in which these accord with, say, Lecourt's arguments or Grotius's arguments in favor of free trade. But you can see they're also, in a way, sharper. Right? That's partly because economic reasoning has advanced in the previous century, especially with Adam Smith's contributions. And it's also partly because utilitarians are consequentialists. They care about the consequences of actions, really even more than the motivation of those actions. And as long as trade is done honestly and both sides know what the terms of trade really are, there's no fraud, no coercion involved, then the trade is going to benefit both parties and is a good thing. Right? So if you think of Bentham's conclusion, it basically is arguing that people should do pretty much what they want to. There's a justification for extensive liberty, and also, as it applies to markets, for extensive freedom to trade and enter any kind of career path that one might wish to, um, as long as it's not done fraudulently or with coercion, pushing it along. Now, the next person we're going to talk about today is John Stuart Mill. Mill grew up in a utilitarian household. His father, James Mill, was a philosopher, early economist, and was closely associated with Bentham's circle. And so John Stuart Mill grew up in a utilitarian household, met many prominent liberals and utilitarians, and was encouraged by his father to become an intellectual through rigorous education at home. With such an upbringing, it's not surprising that John Stuart Mill became a utilitarian and wrote broadly on the policy issues of his day. What might be of interest to you students is that Mill began writing papers for political magazines and helped edit books as a teenager. So relative to you guys, to young adults in the 21st century, he had a head start of 10 to 15 years on his career as a philosopher and policy analyst. This probably still happens a bit in some circles, but it's still quite unusual. So Mill is a person who tries to clarify utilitarian ideas, often writing 30, 40, 50 years after Bentham's work on this. And so there have been, half a century of developments, extensions, applications, variations across people and so forth. And what Mill is trying to do in the work that we're studying in this course is to kind of restate the utility principle in clear terms and to chase out some implications that are missing from Bentham and from others working in this field of philosophy or public policy analysis. So utilitarianism is the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, which holds that actions are right in proportion, in the proportion that they promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, the opposite of happiness. By happiness, it is intended pleasure in the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and privation of pleasure, absence of pleasure, loss of pleasure. To give a clear view of the moral standard set up by the theory, much more is required to be said, in particular what things it includes in the ideas of pain and pleasure, and to what extent this is left an open question. So you can see that Mill is basically arguing that many things that Bentham took to be intuitively obvious, half a century of further analysis and criticism had revealed not to be so obvious. And he's trying to tackle some of the issues and clarify the meaning of utilitarianism. And in doing this, in some ways, he goes back to Aristotle even more than Bentham. In others, he's quite original. And seeing how this line of thinking changes, even just from Bentham to Mill, should be of interest, because for the purposes of the book, it reveals that ethical theories do change through time. And these are partly driven by changes in external circumstances. By the time Mill is writing, the middle of the 19th century, economic development has really accelerated compared to what it had been in the past. There's no period where growth was as fast, economic development was as fast as this mid-century experience that Mill is more or less viewing out his window. So he tries to think both about how an individual goes about producing happiness, but also how public policy should be constructed to help people have the greatest opportunity to achieve happiness. So Mill is sometimes called a rule utilitarian. That is the sense that he's using utilitarian analysis to try to generate kind of particular principles or rules for choosing policies or rules for conducting one's life that on average will generate the right result, will on average generate more happiness. we've already bumped into such a rule, and that's Aristotle's assertion that the way you become happiness is through developing intellectual and moral excellence. Right? So anything that would contribute to either of those two excellences would be a good thing. Anything that inhibited those developments would be a bad thing. So that basic concept is not foreign to to the people we've been surveying. But if you think back through the people we've been thinking about, it's different from Smith, for example, though Smith has some notion of this when he talks about virtue. It's a bit different from Kant, partly because it actually has a criteria for judging rules that's really sharp, whereas Kant basically allows for a whole series of different kinds of universal laws to be rules that one should follow. They're basically any rule that would generate good results as you might understand them is a candidate for a universal law and therefore something you might have a duty to follow. Whereas in utilitarians, such laws always, if they're going to be good laws, have to increase on average private and public utility, private and collective, private and aggregate utility. So I regard utility as the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions, but it must be utility in the largest sense, grounded on the permanent interests of a man as a progressive being. And so he's talking about lifetime utility now. Much if you remember some of the initial quotes from Aristotle, where happiness being something that was lifetime satisfaction rather than pleasure just for an instant or two. Those interests, I contend, authorize the subjection of individual spontaneity to external control only in respect to those actions of each which concern the interests of other people. If anyone does an act harmful to another, there's a prima facie case for punishing him by law, or where legal penalties are not safely applicable by general disapprobation. So this is an idea that economists would eventually call externalities. So if you engage in an activity that makes someone worse off, then that type of behavior would be subject to external regulation by the government. And if you were to do this kind of directly, you beat somebody up or destroy their property, things of that sort, then it should be something that's criminalized, punished by law. In those cases, the nasty consequences are imposed on others might be a result of intent, whereas in the case of externalities, it might just be an accident, something you didn't really think about when you chose your action. But in either case, Mill would argue that there's at least, at first pass, a case for punishing people who impose harms on others. He also has some ideas about how individuals should or can achieve happiness. And again, this seems like an echo of Aristotle. He argues that utilitarians not only place virtue at the very head of the things which are good as means of the ultimate end, happiness, but they also recognize as a psychological fact the possibility of its being to the individual a good in itself, without looking to any end beyond it. So a person might aim to be moral, aim to be virtuous, and that may be the only aim he has in his head. He may not be thinking in terms of joy or pleasure or things of that sort. All that kind of association is rooted in the idea of virtue as that person has come to understand it. And he goes on to argue that the mind is not in a right state, not in a state in conformity to utility, not in the state most conducive to the general happiness, unless it does love virtue in this manner as a thing desirable in itself. Okay, well, that doesn't really fall out of the utility principle, at least in my opinion. But it is completely consistent with Aristotle's take on the best method of becoming happy, or most reliable method of becoming happy as an individual. Although there's no mention of Aristotle in this book, as far as I remember. So Mill also agrees with Bentham that Individuals, generally speaking, should not think that hard about the consequences of their actions on all other people in the universe or in their society or their community, um, but rather that this is a responsibility that is part of being a legislator. The great majority of good actions are intended not for the benefit of the world, but for that of individuals, of which the good of the world is made up. And the thoughts of the most virtuous man need not, on these occasions, travel beyond the particular persons concerned, except so far as is necessary to assure himself that in benefiting them, he is not violating the rights, that is, the legitimate and authorized expectations of anyone else. So you have some duty to imagine whether your actions are going to harm another, but essentially you should focus on, your own happiness in most situations. The multiplication of happiness is, according to the utilitarian ethics, the object of a virtue. The occasions on which any person, except one in 1,000, has it in his power to do this on an extended scale, in other words, to be a public benefactor, are but exceptional. And on those occasions alone is he called on to consider public utility. In every other case, private utility, the interest of happiness or some few persons, is all that he has to attend to. So this mid-19th century interpretation basically says that people should do what advances their interests as they understand them and not worry too much about their effects on others, because in most cases what you do has little or no effect on others, and therefore can be safely ignored. Mill does spend quite a bit of time talking about sort of the dividing line between areas in which people should be free to do things and areas in which the government or society might want to intervene and control or at least influence the kind of decisions that a person might make. This was true in Jeremy Bentham's work too, although he spends less time on it. And you'll see that Mill has a couple of ideas running through this section of his thinking. One is that as long as your behavior doesn't hurt someone else, you should be free to do it. The other is that there are a variety of hurts that might be taken into account, and this may significantly reduce the sphere in which people are completely free to do what they wish. And there are other cases in which the types of rules that you'd expect governments to adopt actually make things worse instead of better. And those are also areas in which you might want to avoid having governments intervene. Not because it's impossible for them to make things better than they are presently, but because they're not likely to adopt such rules, but rather to adopt rules that actually make people worse off. So the moral rules which forbid mankind to hurt one another, and which we must never forget to include wrongful interference with each other's freedoms, are more vital to human well-being than any maxims, however important, which only point out the best mode of managing some department of human affairs. They have also the peculiarity that they are the main element in determining the whole of social feelings of mankind. So this last part, I think, is just meant to say that these efforts to avoid hurting other people turn out to have a very substantial effect on the average happiness of people in your community, and thereby tend to have the among the most substantial effects on social welfare, aggregate utility, average welfare in the community of interest. It is their observance which alone preserves peace among human beings. If obedience to them were not the rule and disobedience the exception, everyone would see in everyone else an enemy against whom he might perpetually be guarding. I mean, he must be perpetually guarding himself. So without this self-restraint, we would be back in what we'll see as what we call the Hobbesian jungle in the second part of this course, which is part 1 of the book. So And that's an important claim, and it's one, of course, that this book is sympathetic with, that some kinds of internalized norms solve really important social dilemmas and thereby make everyone better off. It is the interest of the community that of the two methods producers should adopt, of two methods, one efficient, one more efficient than the other, that the producer should always adopt the one that produces the best article at the lowest price, this being also in the interest of the producers, unless protected against competition and shielded from the penalties of indolence or laziness. The process most advantageous to the community is that which, if not interfered with by government, they ultimately find it to their advantage to adopt. So this, in my view, is a bit tangled, the sentence, this series of sentences, so he's talking about competition here, right? So you can imagine there being two ways of producing something. One that's a lot more efficient in the sense that it produces better things at lower prices, and the others being perhaps an old-fashioned way of doing something that people have some emotional attachment to. And he argues that competition tends to induce producers to try to find cheaper ways to produce things, and also find ways to produce better things, because both those strategies will tend to increase their profits and their sales. And this process of competing for consumer dollars is a good one. It's very advantageous to the community. And if it's not interfered with by the government, producers will and individuals will ultimately find it to their advantage to promote competition between firms. So in the first paragraph here, he's also aware by this time that innovation is an important part of the ways markets improve goods and services for individuals. And as long as those experiments don't hurt others, other persons, the experiment should be undertaken independently of all consideration of constitutional liberty. That is, more or less thinking about what's practical, what's a good thing to do. The best interests of the human race imperatively require that all economical experiments voluntarily undertaken should have the fullest license, and that force and fraud should be the only means of attempting to benefit, and force and fraud should be the only means of attempting to benefit themselves, which are interdicted to the less fortunate classes of the community. So what that sentence is telling you is that basically force and fraud are the only areas where government should intervene in markets. This is the so-called doctrine of free trade, which rests on grounds different from, though equally solid with, the principle of individual liberty asserted in this essay. Restrictions on trade around production for the purposes of trade are indeed restraints, and all restraint, qua restraint, is an evil. The restraints in question affect only that part of conduct which society is competent to restrain, and are wrong solely because they do not really produce the results which it is desired to produce by them. So he's not saying that it's never consistent with the utility principle to regulate trade, but he is saying that if, when governments attempt to do so, they essentially never realize those benefits and usually just cause benefits or average utility to fall as the markets shrink and gains of trade diminish. So mid-century utilitarian thought, as characterized by Mill, are pretty supportive of open trade. And I should mention that Mill in this is on the left end of what I would call mid-19th century liberalism. That is, he believes in a larger scope for government intervention than many other liberals in this period, than other utilitarians in this period. And yet, at least with respect to commerce, he is generally opposed to interfering, mostly because the interference is likely to cause more harm than good. So laissez-faire, in short, should be the general practice. Every departure from it, unless required by some great good, is a certain evil. And that concludes the first half of the material on utilitarianism. You can see that support for careers in commerce, for commerce itself, and for policies that support commerce are clearly in evidence in these two authors. And I think it's fair to say that this is a very common sentiment in the mid-19th century as economic development is accelerating and occurring at rates never before experienced, or at least not for well over 1,000 years in Europe. And so with that, we'll conclude today's lecture. Next time, we'll take up Herbert Spencer and Alfred Pigou. Spencer is a doctrinaire liberal / utilitarian who believes in social evolution. Pigou is a left liberal who believes that externalities can be significant problems and that governments might want to intervene in those areas more aggressively than implied, say, by John Stuart Mill or Herbert Spencer. So with that, we'll stop for today, and I'll see you next time.